And then the next moment I hear this classic sound of instantly recognizable of bang, 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 bang. And I just know that he's dropped our kayak and it's traveling down the slip towards where there's a huge cliff drop off.
Hello, and thanks for joining. A few things before I begin. First, I wanted to take a brief moment to do something that I don't tend to do enough of. I want to express gratitude for all the people who've taken time out of their lives to share their stories on this podcast. I also want to thank those who have given me positive feedback about the podcast. It's truly what's kept me interested in keeping it going. I'm even more thankful for those who don't like the podcast but have shut up about it. Hopefully it'll stay that way. Speaking of gratitude, I'd also like to introduce the first sponsor of the show today. Believe it or not, money did not factor into the equation when I started this podcast, but it would be nice to cover some of my expenses. However, I really only want to advocate for people, services, and products that I believe in. With that in mind, today's episode is sponsored by Taylor Barker with the Group Real Estate Steamboat. I've paddled and mooched shuttles off of Taylor for years, and I can tell you that he's a great guy who's passionate about paddling, passionate about the outdoors, and who's made Steamboat Springs his home. Steamboat Springs is a wonderful town with the Yampa River running right through it and has a vibrant and friendly boating community. If you're thinking of making a move to the Steamboat area or purchasing a vacation home, be sure to get in touch with Taylor. He's happy to give you a lay of the land, the real estate market, and help find the perfect property for you. You can reach him at 336-314-4353 or by email at taylor@brokerandtheboat.com. And you can find those links in the show notes. Furthermore, this show is being featured on paddlinglife.com. Paddlinglife.com is a website that features paddling news, reviews, and more. Go check it out. Now, the show today is part of my recent social web spinning off of my friend Rolf, who will be featured in a now highly anticipated future episode. In fact, Rolf played such a key role in my guest's formative paddling experiences that we ended up with a full section of awesome stories involving the two of them. My guest also kept me up until 1:30 in the morning, but I didn't want to cut him off because I was enjoying the conversation so much. But I've decided to split the interview into two parts. So here is part one, The Rolf Chronicles. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Crypts, a whitewater storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Cripps. When I was interviewing my friend Rolf for an upcoming episode, he concluded by giving me the names of a few quote-unquote nuts that I needed to talk to for the podcast. And among those is my guest today, Gareth. Gareth comes to me from halfway across the world. He's a Kiwi, but currently stationed in Tasmania. And as a teaser, Rolf described Gareth's athletic ability as a, quote, freak of nature, and that his strength and keen eye for safety literally saved Rolf's life, as well as perhaps a number of other people throughout the years. Rolf spent a good bit of time traveling to and paddling around New Zealand. And for anyone that knows Rolf, you can readily guess that the people who he associates with don't shy away from adventure. And anyone that spent any time paddling with Kiwis knows that they don't shy away from adventure. And you can be guaranteed that Gareth is no exception. So Gareth is joining us today to share some stories from his paddling adventures over the years. So Gareth Fryer, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Good to be here.
Yeah, appreciate you taking the time out from your day. And you said you're currently in Tasmania, stationed there for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm visiting family and doing some paddling, and recently been getting into pack rafting, which is a bit of a shock to my system because I've always been the typical kayaking pack raft hater. But I've actually really come to love it as a mode of travel, to be honest. And so I've got 3 pack rafts now, and I guess at some point I'll have to call myself a pack rafter, as resistant I am to that. But it's a fantastic way to get into some beautiful places and a really easy way to carry your gear down the river and camp on that river. So really enjoying that.
Yeah, I know a couple of people around Colorado that have gotten into pack rafting, and as much as I would like to make fun of them for not being in a hard shell when I see some of the stuff they run and some of the places that they're able to access that would be just brutal with the kayak. It's I can see the temptation. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it has its merits, and there's quite a few rivers here in Tasmania which are dammed, unfortunately, and so there's often lower levels of flow, and so at least you can always get out with the pack raft, and the Tasmanian wilderness and country and stuff's just this superb paradise to be exploring. But yeah, hopefully we're going to get some rain here in the next few days and can get out in the hard shell and get amongst it.
Yeah, I don't know much about paddling out there. What are the rivers and creeks like?
Shallow. They're often brown, so there's tannin which is coming off the leaves and the soil. So it's a browny colour, so it's often hard to gauge that depth. But I guess now, after my experiences so far, I'm just working on the assumption that generally it's shallow. Whereas in New Zealand, we're very spoilt with very blue and clear rivers and deep rivers for the most part. But yeah, it's definitely a different style of whitewater. Like I've paddled a few places in the world, quite a bit of time all over the States, in Nepal, Ecuador. And yeah, the Tassie rivers are again another unique style of whitewater that I'm still kind of getting used to be honest, and getting my head around, because some of it I look at it and I find it quite manky, and it doesn't always excite me that much, kind of thing. So I'm still sort of finding my way a little bit, kind of thing. But luckily, there's some great paddlers here and some good people to show me around and show me the ropes, which is nice.
Yeah, sounds like a Colorado's dream come true. You know, front range, we love the make.
Yes. Sure.
What are the rivers? Do the rivers tend to be accessible, or are a lot of them? Is there a good reason to have a pack raft to go in there?
The main thing for pack rafting, I think, is the one point that I mentioned, that sometimes they're only putting environmental flows down some of these rivers because there's a lot of dams. But some of the wilderness areas are quite remote, and say the Franklin, which is a world-class multi-day trip, a lot of people might spend 8 to 10 days on that. I haven't done it yet, but a lot of people do that in a raft and also in a kayak. But I think from my own overnight kayak trips, I always find that a bit of a drag, and I actually think it's easier to carry and nicer to actually have your overnight stuff in a pack raft than, to try and do a 7-8 day trip out of a kayak is not my idea of joy. So yeah, and just the terrain and the nature here, like I was just messaging with someone late last night who's off to do some epic walk into some super remote place, and they're going to link a couple of different rivers together and then climb out over some mountain range and drop into some other river and stuff. So there's a lot of unique opportunities for real adventurers to be getting amongst it here, kind of thing. And like, I haven't even gone near any of that yet, and would like to one day, but that's a whole nother level of commitment, I suppose. So.
Yeah. I picture all kinds of poisonous things around there. Is that accurate?
It's not too bad. There's spiders and snakes. I haven't really come too close to a snake in the wilderness yet. Saw my first scorpion inside the house the other day, which was a tiny little thing, but there was a big spider on the wall here the other day that was almost as big as my hand, which takes a little bit of getting used to. But those are the huntsmen. And they're actually pretty friendly, really, and they eat white-tailed spiders, which are a bad spider. I've been bitten by something on my leg once. One other time I was here, I don't know what it was, but I definitely started having to mark the margins of where the flesh was starting to degenerate, and I'm a bit stubborn about going to the doctor, and so I'd marked it up. I'm definitely going to the doctor tomorrow if this is worse, because I don't want to have my leg amputated, and I've still got a fairly healthy scar from that. But like anywhere, there's pros and cons. But I think for the most part, it's pretty safe here. And someone told me a while ago they have some quite big ants here called a jack jumper, and those are supposedly, out of all the big nasties, those are the biggest killer, and it's just people having an anaphylactic shock as a response to getting bitten by those kind of things. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there's other beautiful animals. We have a bush reserve behind us here, and so there's little wallabies which is like a small kangaroo, jumping around here everywhere. And if you're lucky when you're out driving, you're seeing wombats and echidnas, which are like a giant hedgehog or porcupine. So yeah, it's cool, and as a Kiwi coming over here, it's a whole new playground, new environment, and so much to learn and see, which is fantastic and exciting.
Yeah, that sounds like an Australian stereotype to me.
Yes, for sure. So.
I'm curious, are there a lot of paddlers in the area? I mean, relatively speaking, or is it?
Yeah, I think there are. It's quite a different scene in the sense that there's quite. I'm based in Hobart, which is the capital of Tasmania, and the kayaking scene largely operates on 3 or 4 messenger groups. And there is there's a few, I think there's 3 or 4 strong kayak clubs. The kayak club down here in Hobart's called the Derwent Canoe Club, and it's pretty awesome. It's giving a lot of young kids opportunities into the sport through slalom, and slalom is very popular in Australia, and they're coming up with really fantastic skills and growing up through the sport. And there's also some very committed people here and north in Tasmania who are giving Joe blogs, anyone off the street opportunities to just try kayaking and have a go and grow into that sport. So I've sort of been joined in part of that mix. They kindly lent me some kayaks and stuff when I first came here. And then I've sort of been trying to give back with a little bit of instruction and some rescue training and those sorts of things. And so they'll do like a once a week session up on the river, and then a guaranteed river trip once a month for the club members, for people who are just sort of grade 3 and under, which is nice. And then there's a lot of people here as well who are charging hard, pushing grade 5 limits. And there are some pretty amazing rivers here which can give them those opportunities as well. So yeah, I think per capita, I think kayaking's actually pretty strong here. A lot of mainland Australians are coming down to Tasmania in their holidays or for certain races to participate here. So it's pretty cool. So.
Yeah, that's very cool. I know nothing about any of that, so it's very interesting. Yeah. I think that's one of the things people have often noted in the U.S. that we lack a lot of those kind of support systems that allow people to get into the sport.
Yeah,
I think that changes. I think it's changing here and there, but there aren't. I think most people that get into kayaking, they have to be pretty motivated. There aren't easy access points. If you don't have some spare change to be able to buy all the equipment, it can be kind of a cost barrier.
And I think from my experience in the States, Kevin, I think a lot of people in the States tend to learn from a mate dragging them out and taking them down a river. Whereas I think, the UK, Australia, and particularly New Zealand, there's very, very strong club scenes, which can be an excellent pathway for getting people started. But there's also the people taking their mates out and that sort of route. But the club's an awesome way, I guess, just for people to meet other people with a similar interest, and then I always think that the healthiest model is, you maybe do a couple of years with that club, find your crew of buddies who you gel with, and then take off and start having your own adventures and starting to learn how to paddle grade 3, 4 and so forth and go from there. So.
Yeah, for sure. That's a fantastic model. Yeah. Well, why don't we transition into some of the stories here? And since I kicked it off, I mean, I got referred to you through Rolf. Yep. We have some Rolf stories that are coming here, and probably this month I'll get that episode up in the show on the show. And so why don't we jump into it? Give me an introduction to you and Rolf. And
sure. So I met Rolf. I was living in Christchurch, which is on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand, and around that time I had started paddling a little bit with the university club, which is called the UCCC. And they were all in all going through a fairly PC, politically correct stage. And I didn't necessarily fit that model very well. And Rolf rolled along. He was there doing some study. This was probably late 90s from memory. I was probably about 19 years old. And he came along, and he was someone who was super, super passionate and focused on his paddling, pretty fit, and very intelligent, but also had a looseness about him and a good sense of humor, a great laugh that you would hear from the other side of the room, and a bit of spark of personality. So I was instantly drawn to Rolf, and we started doing a few trips together. He had another mate, Pete, who was over there studying with him as well. And so often it was the three of us. Pete was a slightly weaker boater, but we'd be doing quite a few trips. And we started doing more and more on the West Coast. And so that was about a 3-hour drive from Christchurch. And as every kayaker would know, often it's the road trip to the river, which is where the fun and the antics and the stories and the laughs and all that experience, come into play, kind of thing. And we certainly had our fair share of that. I've got vivid memories of driving with Rolf, and he would love to, if anyone's seen Pulp Fiction and Samuel L. Jackson and Ezekiel 25:17, I think it is, if that's burnt in my brain correctly. And we'd just be driving along, and Rolf at the top of his voice would be screaming out, the path of the righteous man is beset by the whatever, and would reel off a whole few lines out of the movie and stuff. And, anyone else who didn't know us would be sitting there thinking, what the fuck? But Rolf and who I was and his personality and stuff, and that was just pretty normal kind of thing. Another classic was Tool do a song, Die von Satan or something like that, which sounds a lot like, if you listen to it, it sounds like you are at one of Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. But the irony being, it's actually a muffin recipe being recited in German, but it sounds a lot more like Hitler's political speech kind of thing. And
that's a new one to me.
That was another classic for Rolf to be screaming in my ear while I was trying to drive the vehicle, kind of thing. So around about that time, I'd already been running grade 5 rivers for probably a year and a half. And a lot of the access to the rivers around Hokitika on the west coast is all done by helicopters. And so it was a pretty fun way to go and have an adventure. Back then, helicopters were pretty cheap, and we could get on a chopper for what would have been $35 or $40 back then. So it was nothing.
Yeah. There was some history to that someone was telling me about a long time ago, that why it's so cheap, that it was originally done for, I don't know, that there are all these helicopter pilots for some kind of government reasons.
Yeah, so we had, so there's no predators in New Zealand, and so possums, red deer, goats, numerous other things, a whole bunch of plant species were released back in the day by the early European explorers, settlers, because they thought that would be a winning strategy. And then 100 years later, or even less, they probably figured out it wasn't a winning strategy. And so initially, there were government hunters, deer cullers, who would go and stay in the hills hunting deer, and they would keep the tails as evidence that they'd shot a deer, and so they would get paid. And so the benefit of that, actually, which has been a tremendous benefit for a long time for all Kiwis or New Zealanders, is that nearly every valley throughout New Zealand has a hut system in it. So it'll have a walking track system and a hut system. So there'll probably be a hut every 2.5 to 3 hours apart. And so a lot of those huts were the early camps of all of these deer cullers. And so they were set up in there, and they might spend a month or 2 months in there. They would either hike in their rations, or they'd get flown in and thrown out of a fixed wing plane, or gear would get helicoptered in and stuff. And so initially the hunting was all done by foot. And then down the track, they decided that there was potentially more money in the meat or the velvet. And so they started trying to get the deer deer out of there. And so, and my order of progression on this might not be perfectly right, but one stage it went through was called bulldogging. And so there'd be the pilot in the helicopter, and they'd often be flying a Helia or a Hughes 300, which is the chopper that we normally flew in with kayaking, and some early model choppers as well. And so basically the crewman, there'd be no door on the chopper. He'd be hanging out the door of the chopper with one or both legs on the skids, and the pilot would chase the deer down and try and get as close to it as possible, and picture a deer with nice sharp antlers pointing up at you, running at whatever speed it runs at, and a helicopter chasing it. And so the chap would jump out of the helicopter onto the back of the deer and wrestle the deer to the ground and tie it up. And so that was called bulldogging. And so as you can imagine, a lot of people got injured doing that. So there was some craziness of the people doing the job, and there was also some crazy pilots. And that whole system grew a little bit, and they started developing net guns. And so it was basically a net stuffed into a homemade barrel attached to a shotgun. And so they would shoot a net out of the barrel of this thing. And the early methods were blowing the skids off the chopper, shooting through the bubble. The odd net probably went into the helicopter blades and crashed the chopper. And some wild times. A lot of shooters were having their shoulders ripped apart because the charges in these shotguns were too strong and stuff. So pretty loose times. And so a lot of the pilots that came from that era were very good pilots, quite wild, because in the peak of all of that, there was so much money in this that shooters were shooting at the opposition helicopters. And fuel was getting messed with, and they were wild times, and anything went. And there were definitely a few people who had definitely crossed the line with other people, other companies and stuff. A lot of people died in that era. Some crazy stories. I was just telling someone the other day that there's a story where they were restationing their pile of deer to a pickup point on a hill or something like that, or maybe they just load it into a net, and the guy on the ground, the pilot didn't see, as he lifted off with the net, this chap's boot got hung up in the net, and so he's hanging by his boot,
No way.
And the chopper takes off, and it's 1,500 meters above the floor of the valley, and the pilot's got no idea that this dude's hanging off the net, and so some pretty hair-raising adventures and stuff. And so I can remember as a kid, I was probably 17 when I got on my first helicopter for paddling, and the old boys who were probably 50-ish, they pretty much told me that I was just going to sit in the back and shut up and not ask the pilot to do anything exciting, because these are the pilots who would do something exciting if there was a slight mention if that was a good idea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some true wild men in those things.
Yeah. So generally, if you think of like a little bubble chopper, different version, but a little bit similar to the bubble on the choppers that we maybe used to watch in MASH as kids.
I can picture that.
Yeah. So we've got the bubble, there'd be the pilot and two of us squeezed in. You always had to sort of shrink your broad kayaking shoulders. The kayaks would get strapped onto the skids of the chopper, and he had some little cradles just above those later on, and then the paddles would get tied on as well. Great way to travel. So we could fly for 7 to 10 to 15 minutes into somewhere that might give us 5 hours, 6 hours on the water, solid, 4+5 water. And in some instances, the downside of that is that if it all went horribly wrong, it might take 11 hours or so to get out of that location, kind of thing, because some of them didn't have a track system or a hut system, and so you were a little bit remote on a few other runs, kind of thing. But it was awesome, there were these amazing rivers. Within Hokitika, you could probably, within an hour and a quarter, you could probably access 25 different rivers, and some of those are definitely world-class rivers and some very difficult rivers as well. So Rolf and I started cutting our teeth on a lot of that stuff more so, because throughout a lot of my paddling career, I've never really had a team of mates. I've only ever sort of picked up a person here or there who might be in my life for a year or two. And Rolf is one of those people. And Rolf is the person who I was charging hardest with ever. And so and a lot of the trips we were doing was often just the two of us. And yeah, you could definitely argue from a safety point of view that that's not the safest number. Ideally having 3 or 4 or 5 is better. But Rolf and I had a very strong bond and commitment to each other and a similar way of rolling. We had each other's backs, and it worked well for us, and I'll always cherish those memories and those adventures, as I'm sure he will. So yeah, so it was pretty good times really. So.
Yeah, he's certainly spoken fondly of that too. I think those days meant a lot to him.
Yeah. And so I guess getting into a couple of stories, I suppose. One time we were paddling a river called the Kakapotahi, which is a bit of a mouthful. The locals call it the Kakapotahi. So if you're talking to a local, you've got to pronounce it that way. Otherwise, they'll sort of say, "What are you talking about, boy?" So we're on there one day. The river's got an upper gorge and a lower gorge, and the upper gorge is quite tight. It's a steep-sided granite canyon, and it's got 7 or 8 rapids in it. Some of those are some sort of smaller waterfalls and stuff. And on this particular day, Rolf and I had done one of our highest flows through there ever. And towards the end, we call it a cave, but it's really just a big slab rock that's fallen over against a cliff wall. And there was a little drop into the entrance of that cave, and then the rest of it was clear. But if you got swept the other way, there was a toilet bowl type siphon that was probably about the size of a little bit smaller than a dining, well, say half the size of a dining table with a giant vortex on it. And so if you screwed this entry move up and went that way, you were not in a happy situation. So this day, the entrance to the cave was quite a tiny little triangle somewhat because of the flow being up. The flow had come up even while we're on the run. And so I've got quite a good photo at home looking back up at this thing, and it looks like, how did you even get through that? But anyway, we got through that run. We got down to the lower gorge, to the lower run, which has a gorge very early on in it. The upper run's probably, I don't know, 4+ish, but with a bit of commitment. And the lower run, depending on the flow, is anywhere from 3+ to 4+5. And this gorge and the lower run has a giant gravel bar at the entrance of it. And just as we arrived down there, one of the club boaters who was there, they were on their own trip, warned us, put your boats up pretty high because the river's just come up. And so that they'd experienced the rivers come up several feet on them just in the 15, 20 minutes that they'd been there. And luckily they'd sort of noticed that and rescued their boats before they started floating away. And so, we took his advice on board, and I put my boat about 3 meters above the river, and Rolf put his about 2.5 meters. I think we were each paddling wave sport wise at that stage, possibly. There was a swing bridge at the start of that gorge, and so we were standing on the swing bridge looking at the first move, which was looking pretty intense. Normally there's some lines to be made there, multiple moves, whereas on this day it was basically a 5 meter, 4.5, 5 meter waterfall on the river left. And so we were sort of pondering whether we were going to run that or not. The club boaters were all portaging at this stage. And the next moment, I think it was Rolf who saw it first, and one of us was like, "Oh, look, someone's running it," And so we turn around, and then we're both simultaneously jaws drop, and we're like, "Oh!" And it was his boat sitting upright, taking quite a nice line through the center of the gorge, and so we're suddenly like, "Shit!" And so I started running across the bridge, and he was like, "Go and get your boat." And we'd already been doing quite a bit by this stage, and so, in retrospect, I think he meant go and rescue your boat, Gareth, so it doesn't float down the river, whereas I took that to mean go and get your boat and get in the river and go and fucking run this and rescue my boat, kind of thing. And so that's what I proceeded to do. And anyway, that all went well. I got through the gorge, and at the tail end of the gorge, these club boaters. And so I said to them, tell Rolf to head downstream. I'll get his boat, and I said it very clearly and with conviction of like, I'm going to achieve this goal. And so anyway, Rolf ran portage, whatever, caught up with these club boaters, and Chinese whispers, somehow that message, which I had clearly conveyed, got reported to Rolf. Gareth said to walk out, which is the polar opposite of what I said. And so Rolf, being Rolf, ignored that and carried on down the river for half a kilometre or so, up in the bush in the forest, looking to catch up with me, kind of thing. And I did catch his boat. I climbed it up out of the river a little bit, tied it to some trees above where I thought water level could possibly reach, and we hung out for a while. But then we kind of decided, like, river's coming up. There's no way he's probably going to come this far down the river, and so we carried on. And he probably did actually end up getting fairly close to it, but by that stage we weren't there anyway, and he never found it anyway. So he went back, and the club boaters and himself. So just he exited. Maybe one or two other club boaters did. So suddenly my trip had changed because my safety net is not there anymore. He's exiting the river, which was probably going to take an hour and a half, 2 hours of bush bashing. And so suddenly now I'm amidst these club boaters who, some of them were some very good boaters, some good friends, and I knew most of them. And so we're heading on down the river, and the river just kept getting bigger and bigger, essentially. And we got to one rapid where normally there's some quite staunch double drops against the right-hand wall. And we were eddied out probably 300 feet above those rapids, and everyone was getting pretty anxious. They asked where we were, how we should run it, and I sort of reminded them, we're at that rapid. Normally we go right, and they were like, so we go right? And I was like, no, I'm going to go as far left as I possibly can. And as it happened, so I pulled out first, and as it happened, I went off that first horizon line backwards because just the boiling water, I was so out of control, and I was by far the strongest boater there, so that wouldn't have encouraged them psychologically. But anyway, I did all right, grabbed an eddy at the bottom of that rapid. People started coming down. Most people had a bit of a surf and a hole, but everyone stayed in their boats, luckily. And then this was a little interesting added potential pretty bad decision on my part, actually, here, which I'm happy to speak about because I think there's learning in this. But the last boater came down, who I think was actually the dude who had miscommunicated that message to Rolf. And he communicated that our friend Angus, who was one of the oldest paddlers there, who was in an open C1 boat, was walking out. And so between being caught up in the rising river and managing this whole situation and trying to formulate a plan and all of that, I somehow processed that information that, Angus has paddled across the river to the side that we're now on at the start of that rapid, and now he's walking out. And somehow my brain forgot the part where I couldn't even manage to be facing forwards on that gnarly flat water that was super boily. And so, because if I'd thought about that, there's no way Angus would have been able to do what this chap had said. And so we decided that most of the party were going to walk out, and one guy, Barry, was going to continue paddling with me because it was still manageable for him and I. And the wives driving shuttle were going to start getting pretty anxious if they didn't know where we were for another 4 or 5 hours. So we were about to leave, Barry and I, and head down the river, and the other crew was about to leave to begin walking out with their boats. And if that had happened, my friend Angus would have died, and I'd largely look at that like that would have been fully my responsibility as the team leader at that point, because a moment later Angus swam by, and luckily a couple of people hit him with throw bags, and they got him out, because that would not have been survivable for a swimmer, particularly someone a bit older at that flow. that was quite a wake up for me as to, sure, my day started out just with Rolf, but I then got melded into that group of others. And even though I was taking a leadership role, I overlooked parts of that, and that could have cost my friend his life, So luckily we got him, and we just tailed his canoe down the river for 40 minutes or whatever, staying the hell away from it until we got down to the farmland, and then we rescued it. And so luckily, everyone was okay. So the next day, that team who walked out, they left their boats behind because they thought it was pretty full on. And I never quite understand that rationale. I know when I was paddling in Ecuador, a lot of people were doing that too. They'd have a drama, they'd leave their boat behind and then come back in a few days, which I'd rather suffer once personally. And so this crew left their boats behind, planning to go back in the next day. Rolf and I, that happened on a Saturday. Rolf and I had the plan that we were going to fly up another river called the Arahura, which is a classic, beautiful pull drop, beautiful blue run, which is a heli trip on the coast. And so we got up at 5:30 in the morning or something ridiculous, and I was towing him on the back of my boat down into that same river. It had dropped heaps the night before. And so, I think 9 o'clock. And so rescued his boat, fanged down the river, or came back up and climbed out. And probably 10 o'clock that same day, we were in a helicopter heading up an entirely different river, while the other crew spent the rest of the day retrieving their boat.
Hiking their boats.
Yeah, Rolf was definitely committed to getting things done and lots of paddling and stuff. And even though that day was a bit of a mistake, I think, again, it strengthened our commitment to each other and how we worked together well, which was nice, I think.
Solid motivation all around.
Yeah.
I assume it was just rain that was bringing the river up and down so quickly?
Yes, yeah. And like I've been in the upper gorge of that run, and it's come up 21 feet in under 30 minutes. And on that particular day, we were climbing for our lives up gorge walls pretty much. Hokitika gets approximately 27 feet of rain a year. So it's pretty wet, and the rivers can come up a huge amount within 6 or 10 hours kind of thing. We sometimes get a foot of rain in a 12 or 24-hour period. And because the Southern Alps and the mountains are very close to the ocean, a lot of that water is shed and dissipates fairly quickly, whereas in other parts of New Zealand, we've had some bad flooding recently up in the North Island and other areas of New Zealand. Because of the topography, it simply can't cope with that rain, whereas the West Coast, for the most part, handles it pretty well. But the terrain is, the rivers are new as far as their geology, and unlike slick California bedrock, where it's pretty sweet and there's unlikely to be sieves or too many trees and that sort of stuff, like sieves are the thing that we're dealing with a lot. There's a lot of sieves, a lot of undercuts kind of thing. And I guess you get used to operating around them and looking for them and hopefully protecting them. Whereas here in Tasmania, I've probably only seen 3 sieves, but there's trees everywhere, all over the rivers, unlike I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. And just trying to get your head around that is different, not a cup of tea. So.
Yeah, interesting. Each region has its own hazards.
Yes.
To my loss, I'm sure I've never paddled in New Zealand, but I've heard that same thing, that it's great paddling, but you have to get your head in the right space for dealing with all the sieves in the river.
Yes, definitely. So a lot of that paddling scene that Rolf and I were enjoying back in the day, there was a pub called the Mahinapua Hotel, which was on a long straight just south of Hokitika. And so we affectionately called it the Poo Pub. And down from the pub, there's a lake, there's a gravel road, forest, there's some glowworms on the side of the road at night time, and there's a lake. And there's a big old steamboat there with a big sign saying no camping. And so naturally that's where all the kayakers slept, because it had a roof over it. So we'd all do our free camping there. So you'd go boating for the day, you'd come back, you'd go to the Poo Pub. Locals generally weren't allowed to the Poo Pub, and but there was a bus company that took foreigners around New Zealand called the Kiwi Experience. And so there'd be a lot of younger foreign people on that bus, a lot of attractive ladies. And so you can imagine the debauchery for a kayaking scene where, a lot of primarily young men are at their peak, pushing these hard rivers, having some exciting days, and then going to the pub to have sometimes a few too many drinks and ladies on tap. And it was a pretty hilarious, chaotic scene kind of thing. There were some wild times kind of thing. And so, for Rolf in particular, coming over to escape university life for a weekend, to get some great boating and have a few laughs in that pub, would have no doubt been some pretty awesome entertainment, I think.
Sounds like paddler paradise.
Yeah, it was pretty good. A lot. So the one interesting thing with that pub was that back in the day on the West Coast, there weren't many paddlers who were permanently based there. And so you were meeting random strangers and you would have to try and size them up a little bit as to where they were at with their paddling, and how, how accurate their version of themselves were, kind of thing. And different countries grade quite differently. Like here in Tasmania at the moment, some of the grading I think is undergraded, whereas the grading that I'm used to in New Zealand, I know that a lot of, I'm not picking on Americans here, or as I used to call them, Americans. A lot of Americans would come over and, they might be like telling us that, oh yeah, they're all over grade 5 and stuff. And then we'd go up a river and I would barely call them a 3+4 paddler. And that's obviously not everyone. I'm talking about one cross section here. So we would sometimes have some shitty situations kicking off because you were basically flying into these places with strangers, didn't know their paddling background. And so sometimes that led to some incidences, and other times it came down to just managing that situation, just to then try and help get those people out of that river valley, whether it was by foot or in their boat or whatever kind of thing. And as you were saying earlier, some people just couldn't adjust to the sieves. And I know that, some teams, some of these gorges have, I wouldn't say it's a blind drop, but very hard to scout, hard to protect entry moves. And one river, the Upper Hokitika, had 3 or 4 gorges. And so some teams, we might be able to paddle that river in 5 or 6 hours, but some teams were in there from 9, 10, 11 hours to being overnighted. And then other teams waited around and got evac'd out because it wasn't their thing and stuff. And so, yeah, it was kind of interesting. And back in the day, there weren't guidebooks and there weren't cell phones and internet and so forth. And so a lot of the information was shared. And that was the one nice thing about the pub and meeting there, is that the flow of information, the sharing of ideas, and letting people know there's a new tree on a particular drop or whatever. Like, a lot of that was really done quite firsthand. And the thing I liked about it as well is, like, if there was a kayaker driving by you, you would literally wave them down or run them off the road and pull them over and, who are you? Where are you going? Do you want to go boating and stuff? And there was a real camaraderie in the scene kind of thing, which I think has been lost a tiny bit, or at least it's morphed into something different, let's say.
Right. Yeah, that is part of the cool thing about the community. So did you have I think this is still a problem today, right? You're meeting people off the internet and things like this, and you don't know who they are. My brilliant invention has always been that you need a Tinder for kayakers. Like,
sure.
Swipe left, swipe right when you look at their picture.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight now from all those experiences of what the best litmus test is to figure out whether you want to paddle with a person or not?
To be honest, I do. And it's a system that I trusted and became dependent on my life upon. And it might seem abstract and weird, but so I like the odd practical joke and to cause a little bit of havoc. And when at that pub, for instance, I didn't necessarily have that much game with the ladies, so maybe this is more why I ended up in this direction. But I figured out that when my kayaking mates were getting a little bit drunk, it was a lot easier to pull pranks on them. because they weren't so likely to see it coming. And anyway, and so at the pub, a couple of my classics for meeting new people, and these were people on all walks of life, not just in the kayaking scene. I used to try and walk this fine line. I thought it was funny. Not everyone did. But so I figured out that if you could push people's buttons a little bit, and if they could laugh, and if they had a sense of humor and they could laugh at themselves a little bit, they were more likely to be honest. And that was so it started out as blind, stupid, reckless humor. But later on, it actually became my psychological testing. My wife calls it hazing, but I call it psychological testing. But so 2 techniques for that, which worked quite well. So the first one was called American arm wrestling, ironically enough. And so you'd ask someone if they'd ever done American arm wrestling, and they'd be like, no, I haven't heard of that. And so we had this, I kind of recruited friends into this as well. But so we had this whole long bullshit spiel about how conventional arm wrestling is mainly focused on the bicep muscle, whereas kayakers are generally stronger than the tricep. So if we lay down facing each other, elbows on the ground, hands up in the air, and if one person cups their hand and the other person clenches their fist, and you try and pull the other person down to the ground while the other person resists. And right when people start thinking, the whole key to the delivery of this was to distract. And so if you thought that you could see them starting to think, so you'd always give the demonstration of them holding their fingertips interlaced and their hands in a non-threatening manner. But in reality, once they lay down, they'd go, so I go like this. And so you'd go, no, you do this. And so you'd change their hands to that clenched fist. And so you'd reiterate to them like, yeah, you're going to try and pull down to the ground and I'm going to try and resist that, blah, blah. And again, right when you see the cogs of their brain starting to turn, you'd distract them and you'd call in a bystander. You'd be like, hey, Bob, can you count us down from 3 or something? And that would generally do the trick. And so they'd be pulling their hands back towards them. You'd be trying to pull them down to the ground and you'd simply let go. And these people would pop themselves in the face. And the odd bleeding nose, no broken noses, but the odd bleeding nose, no black eyes, but yeah. So that was one trick. And but my self-imposed rules with these tricks early on in my younger life, and some of them have flowed on to my later life, is that if someone felt, I'm not a fighter, but if someone felt the need that they needed to hit me, then I would just have to stand there and receive my punishment, kind of thing. And so the other gag that we used to do a bit was called the whale joke. And so you'd ask someone if they'd heard the whale joke, and they'd be like, no, I haven't heard that. And you'd know that you had a good contender straight away. So you go through every animal that you could think of, and you might ask them what noise does a cat make. And if someone was a little bit uptight and anal, they wouldn't even be able to say meow. They might say some sort of purring noise or something like that. And anyway, so you roll through the list. You do every single animal you can think of. And meanwhile, you're casually drinking their beer. And when you ask them about what noise does the whale make, you power spray a mouthful of beer straight into their face at point blank range. And so you'd instantly know if you'd made a friend or an enemy. And so that was one way of figuring out who you were going paddling with the next day. But like I say, and again, I'm not trying to pick on Americans because it's probably mainly Americans who are going to be listening to this possibly, but I think Americans are a little bit more uptight about their personal space, whereas maybe some other nationalities were a bit more open to having beer spat in their face, but I need to put real data on that. But anyway, so I honestly, going back to that, like the people who could have a laugh in the pub and laugh some of that stuff off, like I did honestly feel like there was a link between them being straight up and more real versus maybe being uptight or ego. Ego is something I'm really not into on the river. And because our lives did depend on who we were getting in that chopper with, and that team that we had on the water. And so, yeah, that was kind of my pathway to that. Other people would have had other pathways, which were probably less confrontational. But I was someone who was trying to paddle nearly every weekend. I was very focused on paddling in my life at that point of time in particular. And yeah, unfortunately, on some levels, you did just have to hook up with random strangers, and like you say, Tinder for paddling might have been a useful thing. So,
yeah, I love that psychology play to figure out who your paddlers are.
Yeah.
It reminds me of oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go, Kevin.
Oh, it was just an aside. It reminded me of an orthopedist that I knew who was in training at the time, and I was asking, how do you figure out if someone's going to be a good orthopedist or not, right? Like, because there's a lot of dexterity involved, especially in hands, which he was involved in. And he said, well, we actually do stuff where we take somebody during the interview and we tell them, like, take this knot, or so, take this rope and like tie a knot behind your back, or put these little things together behind your back. And he said, some people will start sweating and drop the thing on the floor, and that's a good sign that they're not going to do very well when they get into the actual practice.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And so paddling, hanging out with Rolf, he was a pretty fit guy. I don't know if he mentioned this to you, he was all about this military exercise. And so he would do this military exercise sequence. He lived at my house for a little while of time, and he'd be out there doing his military exercise thing on the lawn, which probably took him 10 or 15 minutes or something. I think I tried it once and I maybe lasted like 3 or 4 minutes. And like I was fit and strong for my work, but doing that type of thing didn't really spin my wheels. And so I probably gave up after 3 or 4 minutes. But he was pretty committed to doing that. All in all, he ate pretty well. One of the things I didn't really approve of is when, again, on our road trips on the way to the river, he would premix his honey and his peanut butter, which it was a little bit weird, but because like in New Zealand, we don't really do like the peanut butter and jelly. Like that's not a thing. And peanut butter and honey would be slightly more acceptable. And I have to admit, when I was hungry and when I was driving, I would still relinquish, and I'd be like, right, pass me one of those. But yeah, so he'd always get around with this jar of big pre-mixed peanut butter and honey, and I don't know if that thing ever went rancid or how that panned out. But yeah, so he looked after himself, I think, physically and mentally. And some of the stories that we're going to get into, those are definitely major contributing factors, I think, to his positive outcome of those situations, let's say. Kind of thing. Another trip we were doing one time was on the Kokatahi River, which is a heli run, which is one of the harder runs on the West Coast. And again, we flew in there, just the two of us, and there's a gorge on that called Kokatahi Gorge, and there's some very good New Zealand guidebooks that have been written by a chap named Graham Charles, and he's been a modern day Antarctic explorer to some degree, and another local boater who was with him, who has pioneered all of these West Coast rivers largely, named Bruce Barnes, who's a school teacher, who's again given many people a start into paddling and took me under his wing for a small amount of time. So they did the first run on this river, and Carnage Gorge is very hard to scout and gets really quite narrow, like down to probably I want to say 15, 20 feet. And this particular waterfall drop that they got to was probably only 10 feet wide. And so they're above this thing. They'd kind of committed to going into this gorge, basically, which maybe was not the best decision on earth, but we've all made those decisions, haven't we? And so one of them ran it, and I think Bruce ran it first, and he was a bit older, very good boater. And he got, and again, I'm going on memory here on this one, but he pretty much got dealt to in this drop and swam and got flushed downstream. Whereas Graham, so anyway, I think some time went by. Graham then ran it. And Graham got recirced on this thing 5 or 6 times, and each time it was sucking back from, I want to say, 90 to 100 feet away.
What? No way.
And so he was going so deep that it was black, and if you think of a nice New Zealand blue river, to be going that dark on a river like that's pretty deep. And so he would pop up this large distance downstream and then get gobbled and sucked all the way back and went around. And luckily for him, he used to be more of a triathlete and very fit at that stage of his life, and probably that fitness saved his life. Anyway, so they had this giant epic, survived that, and so there were, we all grew up on harrowing tales of Carnage Gorge on the Kokatahi. So on our run down the Kokatahi Gorge, we climbed to the gorge a little bit. We had a little bit of a look at the gorge, and we decided that we couldn't see enough to safely do it. And so Rolf and I started portaging our boats, and that's quite a renowned shitty portage that takes a fast team about an hour to an hour and a half, and a longer team could easily spend 2.5 hours on that. The bush is pretty thick. It's not marked that well, and it's pretty treacherous in places. And so partway through that journey, we would just, you'd get to a pile of trees or a difficult patch or whatever, and you just grab whatever boat was on top. It didn't matter if it was your boat or your buddy's boat or whatever kind of thing. And so doing that, and at one point I'm ahead of Rolf by probably 20, 30 meters. I'm out of sight, and then the next moment I hear this classic sound of instantly recognizable of bang, 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 bang. And I just know that he's dropped our kayak, and it's traveling down the slip towards where there's a huge cliff drop off. And so first thing I naturally do is to turn around and make sure that I've got my boat, which I did. And so I was instantly stoked. But then I had the realization of I'm probably not going to paddle out of here by myself anyway. So the day's still destroyed at this point anyway. And so I go back to Rolf. He's all right. He's just taken a bit of a slide and had to let go of the boat. And so we climb down to the bottom of the slip. And much to our surprise, here's the boat sitting on the riverbank about 6 or 8 feet away from the river. And so the boat had tracked off this, 45 degree, down this 45 degree slip, gone off what was probably a 50, 60 foot cliff, and kept tracking on that same angle and traveled a long way because there was a lot of riverbank that it flew over, and must have just nosedived into the water right next to the riverbank, and rebound back onto the dry rocks. And so we're almost in disbelief, like,
incredible.
How did I get to there? And so anyway, we're like, right, okay, let's go get that. And so we formulated a plan that Rolf could Eddie hop swim down into the start of the gorge, above where this nasty drop used to be. And if he'd be able to see more of the drop from that point, and if it went, he could run it. And if it didn't go, I would be able to do what I needed to do with some eddy hopping, attainment, paddling, some ropes, whatever. I could still get him back out of that gorge if we needed to, kind of thing. So he gets down there and he pretty much signals to me that his boat is fine, and then he has a look at the rapid and that he's going to run it, kind of thing. And so then I'm kind of like, oh no, because I'm already exhausted just from climbing back down in there, and my boat's way still up in the bush. And so I decided that I was just going to carry on the portage, kind of thing. I was going to let him run this thing because he had assured me through hand signals and shouting and whatever that it was good to go, kind of thing. And so I portaged by myself, which was even more epic, for probably another hour. He runs this thing. It's completely fine. And so he's been waiting around for me for quite some time. And so I get to the bottom of that portage and I'm completely exhausted, whereas he's sort of been waiting and fired up and pretty ready to keep paddling some hard water, kind of thing. So that was the first successful run of that gorge since, and it had changed from when the pioneers did their run. And it's a gorge that I'm always wary of it re-changing, because even now in its current state, I probably haven't run it for 4 or 5 years, but there's still a little potential for some nastiness happening, and it only takes one change. And the complacency of just rolling into that gorge going, it'll be the same as last time, when it could revert back to what it was originally, and then, more than likely someone's going to die, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting day out with Rolf again, and luckily his boat wasn't broken. Luckily he could paddle that. I hit the wall later on that day, just energy-wise, and I think doing the rest of that portage by myself just was quite taxing for me. And luckily he had some cheese and crackers, and so he gave me a bit of a pat on the back and fed me some food, and that sort of helped me come right, and we managed to get out of there successfully later on that day, kind of thing.
It's funny. I think I've heard Rolf tell that story. At least I'm pretty sure it's the same story. And although maybe there's a similar one, but his was a slight. It's great, like the Rashomon effect, where everyone has their different perspective. Sure. But yes. He told a little bit different variation, where he said when he fell, when he dropped his boat, that he kind of fell along with it, and ended up on just some little ledge, just by kind of pure luck that he didn't go all the way down to the river with his boat. And and that he was so exhausted from the portage already in the day, that when he got down, to river level and got his boat, retrieved everything, that he couldn't really tell for sure that it was good to go. He did want to do the portage, but he was so exhausted. He was just like, I can't go back up there again. So I'm just going to run it and take my chances on the river.
I would have called him a pussy right there and then if I'd known that. But that all makes perfect sense, actually. And I knew he would have taken a bit of a slide, but obviously I didn't see it. And he probably told me that he was on the edge, but I'd forgotten that portion of it, kind of thing. But that's quite interesting to hear the other side of the coin as to his rationale for running it, kind of thing. Because I was pretty strict with him, like, you're only doing this if this is totally sweet, kind of thing. So,
no, as I recall, he just said he saw the lip that he knew was that place that the previous pioneers had swam, and he just said he gave it the biggest boof he could give it, and was super relieved to come clean through it.
Yeah, classic. Yeah. And then one, I couldn't go. I think I was working or something. But Rolf and my partner, and Pete and some other people, they went off on a bit of a road trip to do some climbing and some kayaking and stuff. And it was on that trip that we've got a very well-known waterfall called Maruia Falls, which is around about 30 feet high. Fairly straightforward drop, but there's been a bit of carnage on it over the years, and a few broken backs, and some people have drowned there. One has been a kayaker who's drowned, but that was possibly at a flow where they maybe shouldn't have been there, and some bystanders and stuff have sort of fallen in a gap in the rocks and stuff, and so there's been a bit of carnage there. But so anyway, so I guess on that trip, and I can't remember if he told me he was going to do this or whatever, but Rolf had taken an inner tube up there with him, and so I get this, I can't remember if it was pre-cell phones or whatever, but and anyway, hear the story or see the footage or however it panned out, or later on saw the footage, and so much to my surprise, Rolf decided it'd be a good idea to boogie board, to inner tube this waterfall. And the story I heard from him is that, he nailed his booth, and I did some tubing as a kid, not down serious rivers or waterfalls. And so when he told me that he nailed his booth, I kind of thought bullshit on that. But then after seeing the footage of it, I was like, oh yeah, okay, you did nail your booth, and he did really well, and huge big stroke with his arms, and managed to launch himself off the whole waterfall, kind of thing. And so I was a little bit, because I always thought he was, he had his crazy side when on our road trips, but on the river, I thought he was definitely operating within the realm of sensibility and stuff, and within his skill level, whereas that definitely raised my eyebrow a little bit of, like, I'm not sure about the sanity of tubing waterfall, I think. All I thought was about the often the truck inner tubes have the nasty old valve of stabbing you in the back or somewhere else less appropriate. So on that same trip, they did some climbing, and then they also did they did a little bit of sea kayaking around Abel Tasman, which is a beautiful place to go sea kayaking in New Zealand, except they were in their creek boats, which I'm not a fan of flat water, and that's probably one of the more moronic things I thought I've ever heard of him doing in a boat, was to go into a multi-day sea kayak trip in a creek boat kind of thing. I thought that was just great. Rolf, beyond that experience, we carried on paddling. The young lady created a little ripple in our lives for a little while, and she was actually part of my journey of coming to live in Colorado for a few years, which was a lot of stage in my life, and that didn't pan out. But anyway, I loved Colorado, enjoyed boating in the States and stuff. Again, different scene. I didn't totally find the crew that was for me necessarily, but did a lot of play boating in Salida and a few other areas, and that was great as well, kind of thing. But there was definitely some carnage went down. We did a run on the I'm going to think of the name of this now. The up in Wyoming, Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And we had a great trip on that. But a couple of the folks who are very good paddlers, who I didn't do much paddling with, who lived in Salida, when they were on that run, they had some truly epic carnage go down with multiple fatalities and broken bodies and so forth, and they just described it as Saving Private Ryan kind of thing. And it's I don't know if you know about that run, but people who do know the run, the beta that was always passed on is, when you get to the last rapid, which is the gnarly one, don't grab that last eddy that you think you can grab, kind of thing. And that was hammered into us by people who knew the run, and this team from Salida knew that beta, but this team who they were kind of eddy hopping with, but not joined teams. But so at that point there, the other team were in front, and they made that mistake, and people died. And hearing about these Salidan paddlers having to deal with the aftermath of that, like, that was a pretty traumatic experience for all involved as well. But a lot of learning kind of thing.
Yeah, I know that run. I know that story where they missed the mandatory portage, and pretty tragic.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So
I'm not sure what else I can tell you about Rolf, to be honest. I'm looking at my list here. I guess the main thing that I am grateful for is a very good friend at a time of my life where I probably was starting to push limits a bit. I wouldn't say beyond our limits, and people might look at some of our, or my in particular, off the river antics as ridiculous and crazy and so forth. But I think I like to think of those days like, that was really Rolf and I cementing our ideas and our ideals of how we like to roll as a team down the river and what that looks like. And again, two people on a river, I don't think is the safest and isn't the best, but it also can build a stronger sense of team kind of thing. And I like to take that sense of team of two and grow that now into bigger teams of people, and really sort of, and live and breathe that role model of, this is how a team should roll down the river kind of thing. And when that's not happening, when possible, try and, summon the courage to step up and change that model, and again, education, growing people, newer people in the sport and starting them on their journey kind of thing is all stuff that I'm passionate about, because a lot of this stuff people just don't know. And a lot of how I look at river safety and river rescue is that I think that genuinely there's a few crazy people in the world, but all in all, people are trying to be as safe as they know how to be. And so sometimes we just need to have our world or our minds or our box expand a little bit, and it's much better to have that expansion done through taking on board other people's learnings or readings or education than it is to go out there and have our own bad experiences. Because if we have enough bad experiences, when we're not going to keep living through all of those bad experiences, eventually they're going to cost us our lives.
That concludes part 1 with Gareth, but check back in soon for part 2 and find out more about how his experiences motivated and informed his keen interest in whitewater safety and how that plays out on the river.